Good afternoon, everyone. As we move into the final part of our day, I'd like to introduce to you the General Manager Industrial of Landcorp, John Hackett, who's part of the support for the Leadership Circle today. Please welcome John Hackett.
Thanks, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the final session of the Ports Conference for 2013. Certainly been an interesting conference so far, and I'm sure the next three speakers, so Joe Ostojich from the Department of State Development, Steve Lewis, the CEO of the Dampier Port Authority, and Jason Sprott from Sprott Planning and Environment, will provide valuable state and local context around the theme ports as gateways. Landcorp's role in supporting integration of our ports with the wider economic and social fabric of the WA community is critical to the ongoing success of the state's industrial framework. Providing sufficient land for industrial and residential developments near to ports, Landcorp is hoping to build strong communities where economic development and employment can build on the facilitation of trade made by our ports. On this basis, it's certainly very appropriate that Landcorp is a proud sponsor of the WA Ports Conference today, and we congratulate the Dampier Port Authority on being such a successful host for this important event. For Western Australia to maximise the business opportunities flowing from its ports, the delivery of industrial land to integrate with ports is critical. Today we've heard the Minister outline the key aspects of the regional freight strategy, so the importance of connecting industrial estates with bespoke transport and logistic precincts will be critical to its overall success. In the regions, WA regional ports are well supported by industrial estates, and as a case study in the Pilbara, the 260 hectare Gap Ridge estate in Karratha and the expansion of Wedgefield equate to half the size of Canning Vale, which has been delivered in the last 5 years. Landcorp also works with the Ports and Department of State Development to facilitate and deliver key strategic industrial estates, such as the Ashburton North Strategic Industrial Area in Onslow, which is facilitating the Wheatstone project. In the metro area, we're also working with the ports and other state agencies to maximise the 4 industrial precincts which comprise the Western Trade Coast. This is close to Fremantle Port and the future private port. The Western Trade Coast includes the Kwinana Industrial Zone, Latitude 32, the Australian Marine Complex in Henderson and the Rockingham Industry Zone, which broadly contributes about $15.5 billion of GDP on an annual basis. The growing Latitude 32 Industry Zone will ultimately deliver up to 1,400 hectares of new industrial land development opportunities. It will be home to hundreds of supporting businesses and support an estimated 10,000 jobs, many of which will be related to the nearby port activity. At Landcorp, we're committed to building economic development opportunities for the state of Western Australia by working with the ports and other key state agencies to de-risk opportunities for the private sector and unlock a greater level of success for the state overall. So again, thank you for giving Landcorp the opportunity to sponsor the WA Ports Conference this year, and please enjoy the final presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, John. As we heard from the Roebourne Shire CEO, Chris Adams, before the break, all of West Australia's ports and the future strategies plainly are developed within a political and social mix, a context that is not only about the economic agenda. And it's this mix of factors that has been the work of Joe Ostojich, especially with the Gorgon gas venture and the Barrow Island and Roy Hill projects connecting iron ore mining to Port Hedland. So to look at yet another aspect of this discussion, please welcome Western Australia's Executive Director of Strategic Projects in the Department of State Development, Joe Ostojich.
Thanks, Jeff, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to use the session that I've got to walk you through some of the strategic projects that have been of the greatest value to this state over the last decade and have really driven what the economy is all about in this during the course of the last decade and will do over the next little while. The two big stories really are iron ore and LNG out of the north. And the common element about all of those projects is that they all need an outlet to the sea or gateway ports. They've concentrated largely on the Pilbara area and the Pilbara coast, and they are extremely important to all of us. The CEOs of both Rio Tinto and of BHP in the weekend press, this last weekend press, have both said that there is a lot of life left in the Chinese market, and they're both gearing up their organisations to take advantage of those opportunities that still exist in that market and, as they say, will continue to exist for a fair while yet. The context I'd like to put this into, Chris went through the evolution of iron ore production and development in the Pilbara, and that's extraordinary in itself, but the period that I want to concentrate on is the last decade. And in 2001, we produced as a state and shipped out about 150 million tonnes of iron ore. That figure at the end of 2011 was about 480 million tonnes. Now that's more than triple what we were doing 10 years previous. And that's put on enormous pressure on all sorts of issues in and around the ports, in and around the communities, and in and around the companies that are developing those projects. It's difficult enough to get the various pieces of physical infrastructure into these areas, but the critical element in all of this is to be able to staff the projects and get people involved and develop communities, which is what Chris was talking about earlier on this afternoon. Just imagine how difficult it has been to get a nurse or a school teacher or a policeman up into the Pilbara, where they might do their job for a year, perhaps a bit more, and somebody turns up on their doorstep and says, "Why don't you come and drive my truck and I'll pay you twice as much, at least." That's been a really difficult issue to manage, and if anybody's got an answer to that, I'd like to know what it is, because we certainly haven't been able to get on top of it, and that's going to be an issue down the track. I'll just walk you through some of the key projects of both iron ore and LNG that have really driven what's been going on up there. The most recent of those projects is Roy Hill. In this state, you can't sensibly build a rail line in the Pilbara, a private rail line in the Pilbara, without a state agreement. And the latest of those state agreements that had gone through the Parliament and had been assented in 2011 was Roy Hill. They have all of the various approvals in place that they need in order to develop their project. That picture that you can see on the screen is the dredging that's happening in Southwest Creek. They are proposing to build 2 berths there that will accommodate their production, which they will mine in the central Pilbara, in a place called the Chichester Ranges in the central Pilbara. They've got a rail line that, or they're going to build a railway line that is about 340 kilometres, and it'll articulate its way into the port facilities that are in Port Hedland and that they will be building for their own use. The capital cost of this project keeps going up a bit and is now pegged at about $9.5 billion. They, as a company, are putting their finances in order. They've got their equity part of the equation under control. The rest of the project, which includes all of the debt elements, will follow pretty soon, I would hope, and they're certainly doing a lot of work around it. FMG, whichever way you cut the FMG story, it's been really, really impressive. I said a moment ago that in 2001 we did 150 million tonnes. When you look at the FMG story, they started production at Cloudbreak and Christmas Creek, well, Cloudbreak first and then expanded to Christmas Creek, and they did they're going to do 100 million tonnes this year, according to their projection, and apparently they're ahead of schedule. They've added to that the production of Firetail, which is in the Solomon area, and they project to be able to get to 155 million tonnes next year. They've been going since 2006, and just think of it, that it's taken 60 years for the state to get to 150 million tonnes in 2001, and they've done it in about 5 or 6 years, a single company. So, you know, they've got the facilities there now, they've got the infrastructure in place, they've been granted a 5th berth of operations in Port Hedland, and they will continue to expand. BHP is a story that really revolves around the initial development of the outer harbour, which would have expanded the capacity of the port to a huge extent. They've had a strategic reassessment of what their position has been. I think that's been a clever thing on their part. Everybody was down on them when they did that, but I don't think that was ever news or should have been news. I think it would have been news if they didn't step back and have a think about where they are in relation to the rest of their projects, like Olympic Dam and the potash project that they had going in Canada, and assess their own capacity for the development and the delivery of the outer harbour. They took a view that the best thing for them to do for the moment is to maximise their capacity inside Port Hedland, and they are moving towards their target of about 240 million tonnes. When they're going to move out to the outer harbour, don't know, but I would expect that they would continually revise that proposition. Rio Tinto equally is an impressive story. They're certainly the biggest producer of iron ore, and they'll almost certainly carry that title for a while yet. They've got the facilities at Dampier and Cape Lambert. In fact, the jewel in their crown is Cape Lambert, because it's almost, I would think, infinitely expandable. The proposal that they suggest is that they've got a significant amount of movement in China and a significant amount of development that they need to add, and growth capacity that they need to add to the equation before they exhaust that opportunity in China, and that's what they're aiming for. Anketel is a port that you wouldn't build other than the fact that the port down the road, which is Dampier, and the port up the road, which is Cape Lambert, are state agreement ports, and you just can't get into that. They are Rio Tinto ports, and you can't go into there. So, as a state, as a piece of state policy, you either accept that proposition, or you take the view that there are a lot of assets around the place, a lot of deposits in the central and western Pilbara that would otherwise be stranded if you can't get that outlet to the sea. And for that purpose, you have to go down the track of building Anketel. As Chris told you a little while ago, the federal environmental agency has ticked it off. We've ticked it off as a state. That is, environmental agencies been ticked off as a state. The native title issues have been progressed, and it will be a piece of strategic industrial land that will serve the state well for decades. So, no surprise about where all this stuff's going. The answer to it all is North Asia. China is by far our biggest market, and Japan and Korea and Taiwan are important, but nowhere near the quantum of material that goes into China. The Chinese story is interesting because of the rate of expansion that's happened there has been beyond anything anybody's ever seen anywhere, really. And if you think about their strategic importance to us, in 1992 we shipped about 13% of our iron ore production to China. In 2002, that figure was 27%. Last year, 2012, that figure was 75%. So 3/4 of our iron ore is ending up in China. So if anybody's got any doubt about the strategic importance of the Chinese economy, that should serve you well, that statistic. LNG is the other part of the story. That's been enormous. As we sit here today, we've got a capacity to produce 21 million tonnes of LNG. That is from about 16.5 from the Northwest Shelf production area, the 5 trains at Northwest Shelf. Add to that Pluto, which is another 4.5 million tonnes. In 2016, Gorgon will come on stream, and that will produce another 15 million. Add to that Wheatstone in about 2017, hopefully. That will produce another 8 to 10. That's about 43 to 45 million tonnes. Add to that Prelude, which is about another 4. That puts you up to about 50 million tonnes that we're going to be able to do in the next 3 to 5 years. That makes us, and that will make us, the world's second largest seaborne LNG supplier, behind Qatar. The Qatari mark is, at the moment, is 77 million tonnes. They are not looking to expand from that figure for 2 reasons. One is that they've got their own moratorium on production for their own economic reasons. Don't clearly understand what that is, but more importantly, they've got geotech issues that they need to resolve in the gas fields. The gas fields themselves are huge, no question about that, but in some areas there are matters that they need to fix. And until that happens, they can't move from 77 million tonnes. If you add up some of the aspirational things that have been talked about, we could certainly go beyond that if all of the ducks lined up. But for the moment, we're second biggest in the world, and we'll continue. We will be second biggest in the world, and we'll continue to move towards that. This is a graphic that Chris also showed. These are the 3 basins. It's the Bonaparte, the Browse, and the Carnarvon Basin. Between the 3 of those basins, there is a reserve base of around 150 trillion cubic feet. The onshore gas, which I'll get to in a minute, has somewhere between, and nobody's very sure about this, but somewhere between about 230 and about 260 trillion cubic feet. So our capacity to develop the unconventional onshore gas is huge, and the reserves are there for us to be a significant player in the LNG and gas market well into the future. The Gorgon project is on Barrow Island. There's a lot of things that are unique about that. There is a lot of production that's already happened. That is the development of the facilities that have already happened. We down here, and Jonathan Smith from the AMC, somewhere there is, he and the AMC have played a critical role in getting some of the material up there. And if it wasn't for that, there would be a lot more freight that's moving on the roads, and there would be a lot more inefficient movement of cargo and capacity. That they will be able to produce at the end of 2016 15 million tonnes from 3 LNG trains. They are already thinking ahead and looking into the future to produce at least the 4th. How that goes and when that happens, don't know. But that's always been a stated view of theirs, and I have no doubt that they will accomplish it. Wheatstone looks a bit like that at the moment. There's essentially nothing there. But the Wheatstone development is extremely important for us. It's really Chevron's answer to what Pluto is for the Northwest Shelf. That is, it's a development that Chevron did on its own with a few minor partners after the development of the Gorgon project. This is located just outside of Onslow, and some of the pressures that I've spoken about a moment ago as well as some of the stuff that Chris Adams raised earlier on, are really contained in this particular area. Onslow is a tiny little place, was a tiny little place of about 800 residents. They will need a residential workforce to get this going of about 5,000 people. That means airports, that means land, that means sewer systems, that means water, that means all of the things that you need to pull together in order to get the people to live there. And on top of that, then, there are schools and there are hospitals and there are roads and there are all sorts of other infrastructure needs that are going to go with it. So LNG is almost the corollary of what I showed you with iron ore. It is still North Asia and it will always be North Asia, but the main market here is Japan, and that will also be continue to be the case for a little while. But the thing that will drive the demand for LNG and the thing that will drive the demand for energy is China into the future. The Chinese have an industrial capacity that, you know, it's really difficult to get your head around, or it certainly is difficult for me to get my head around. They have a electricity generating capacity of about 950,000 megawatts. Just to give you a comparison on that, we have a generating capacity in Collie with 4 power stations of just over 2,000 megawatts. So about 500,000 times more than what we do, or can do. In order just to keep pace with that, with their demand for energy and their demand for electricity for their industrial production, they need to add to that grid a power station every 3 months. That's about the size of Blue Waters. That is about 300 megawatts. They have to do it, otherwise they start going backwards. They have to do it, but they are and they will in the immediate future need to power it with their own coal supplies, and predominantly coal. The problem with all that is that when you go to the main cities in China, the air on a bad day is almost unbreathable. That means they have to do something about it, and they know they have to do something about it, and that means cleaner, more efficient energy. They know that they need to move to LNG in order to do that. They have to shift their production, the energy production, away from coal, and they have to go to LNG. The nuclear option for them is not really attractive. It's got no support among their population, and it's got very little support in the Chinese leadership. So they don't see that as an alternative. Their energy mix at the moment is 70% roughly coal. There's about 16% that comes from hydroelectricity. Or hydro generators. There's about 10 that comes from oil, and the rest is alternative energy. But it's that 70% that's got to change, and the size of the market is such that they have already moved to gas, and that chart that you can see up there, 5 of the receival terminals that are now already in operation. This is from practically none a few years ago to 5 at the moment. There are 4 more that are under construction. There are 3 more that have received approval for construction, but construction hasn't commenced yet. And there are another 20 on the drawing boards. That is something that they could turn around really quickly and put in place very, very quickly. Things happen in China really quickly. Each one of these terminals has or will have, those that are there at the moment and those that are going to be built, some have a receival capacity of about 4 million tonnes. Each of those can be expandable, but some of the new terminals that they're proposing to build will have a receival capacity of about 7 million tonnes. 4 million tonnes at the moment, 7 million tonnes into the future. So you can see they could go from almost zero, which is where they were a couple of years ago, to grow exponentially. The big question then is, where do you get the gas? And if you have a look around in proximity to China, that's an issue. They've got a pipeline they've developed a pipeline that goes from the western part of China into Shanghai and Shenzhen, which is the west-east pipeline. That can carry the equivalent of about 8 million tonnes of LNG. They've got one from their central republics that goes into that area, and they've commissioned a third that goes from Uzbekistan through Kazakhstan and then down. But those three pipelines, first of all, are very expensive. Secondly, that would be about 20 million tonnes of LNG, equivalent 20 million tonnes of LNG, but there's a lot more that they're going to need. So then look around and you've got Sakhalin Island, which is just above them. That's fully contracted, but it can only produce about 10 million tonnes, about 8 million tonnes in any case. You've got Qatar, but the problems that I spoke to you about a moment ago in Qatar will limit them. They already produce some of their capacity into China, or some of their gas into China. Myanmar has got some capacity. Malaysia has got a bit, and they're already selling into China. Malaysia's got the capacity at the moment to produce 24 million tonnes, and I can't see them moving beyond that in the immediate future. Indonesia is a net importer of energy. So that the future's not Indonesia. Papua New Guinea would need to do a lot to get their production going, and I can't see that happening in the immediate future either. In any case, if they did, they could produce about 8 million tonnes. So really the alternative is the northwest of Western Australia, Australia in general, but northwest of Western Australia in particular. So the gas story is not going to go away anytime soon. And if there's going to be an expansion in the state's economy, it will be from that area. That's the onshore gas that I was talking about. There's a cigar shape and a donut shape, and it's all there. So thank you very much for your help, for your attention.
Join us here on the stage. We'll take some questions. To enrich Joe's analysis and complete a day that has stretched us all to a longer term vision, we're going to call on a speaker a very good one who we've saved to last, because Jason Sprott, who is the director of his own Queensland-based planning company, has had a fairly unique opportunity in recent years to assess what we've discussed today in 8 different global cities. We've asked him to try and share that with us, and also the learnings from his consultations with OECD leaders on the development trends in this industry. So please welcome Jason Sprott.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks very much to the Dampier Port Authority for inviting me to come along and address the conference. I am standing between everyone and some cold beverages. I am very much aware of that, so I'll try and skip through my presentation as quickly as possible. The photo on the front page of my presentation was taken by myself in 2011, standing on Yangshan Deepwater Port off Shanghai. It is an amazing port. We heard about it this morning, and it is obviously amazing for a number of reasons, but I think one of them is obviously that it's offshore by 32 kilometres. It is the future of the Shanghai area for port services. The future plan is 20 kilometres of quay line, over 50 berths. It's an amazing facility, and it's probably one of the most amazing infrastructure facilities that I've had the benefit of standing on and standing near in my travels over the last few years. They're not only planning the port, they're also planning a new city on the mainland, a city for 800,000 people. They're putting in rail connections, road connections. They're getting all the land use planning and all the issues that we've spoken about today done correctly. They're thinking about the whole integrated parcel. This is a snapshot from last week. of some of the vessel traffic in the area. You can see there some of the vessels heading up the Yangtze. The Yangtze is obviously now dogged with problems in terms of siltation and whatnot, so Yangshan provides a solution for that area of the globe. It is truly a Chinese gateway port, and it is truly an international gateway port. Together with Tianjin, Hong Kong and Yantian, in which I've also had the benefit of visiting, these ports are simply remarkable pieces of infrastructure that have had long-term planning put into them and a long-term vision created by their installation. So today's discussion, I'd like to draw upon some of my international experience, share some of those personal experiences with everyone here, then talk about the national context, the importance of gateways, some of the issues with the current situation that we're facing here in Australia, and some of the future gateway thinking that I think will be absolutely critical going forward. We've seen a lot of these common themes today. There have been a lot of speakers talk about the themes that I will touch upon in this presentation. So there's definitely some commonality about what I'll present this afternoon. In 2011, as Jeff said, I was very fortunate enough to be awarded a Churchill Fellowship, which allowed me to travel to 8 global cities and look at port development trends and sustainable development trends at these large ports. Through Asia, Europe, the US and Canada, I was able to visit these ports, talk to port managers, talk to government agencies about their approaches to port planning and to the future vision setting in those areas. Rotterdam is there. We heard about the Maasvlakte 2 project this morning. Obviously also another significant international gateway, and obviously a great experience to be able to go and see Rotterdam. So the Churchill Fellowship took me to those points around the globe, and some of my earlier travel when I was with the Port of Brisbane in 2007 saw me also travel through some of the Eastern Asian ports as well. I think at that time, including the port of Busan at South Korea, which I visited the top 5 container ports at that time. A truly remarkable experience and a remarkable professional experience. I think the benefit of international experience is it allows us to look beyond our backyard. And to me, it reinforced a number of points. It reinforced, the influence of culture and history on ports. It reinforced the influence of spatial and interface issues on ports, on their current and future plans. And it also reinforced the influence of social and environmental issues that, again, we've heard about today, that modern port management is all about. It's about facing those issues and facing those issues in a very proactive way. The travel also reinforced to me the importance of partnerships. We've heard that today as well. It also reinforced the importance of strong governance, of economic drivers and connections, the importance of long-term infrastructure and land use planning, and making sure that those two things are aligned. It's not just about infrastructure planning, it's not just about land use planning, it's about the connection of those two that I certainly believe will be the most important things moving forward. And equally, the importance and the need for network thinking. We've heard about that today as well. So there's been some great common themes coming through today's presentation. And of course, thinking beyond the port boundary. Steve spoke about that, about Dampier's approach in that respect. And obviously that is a critical issue now that is recognised at the national level and also at the state levels in terms of port management. So although all ports are different, and they certainly are, the ports around the world that I've seen are very, very different to the ports that we see around our country. They do all have similar gateway issues, and they do all have similar gateway challenges. So no matter what the size, no matter if they're public or privately owned, the fundamentals of gateway thinking and the fundamentals of gateway planning and protection, I believe, exist at all ports. So whether it's Singapore, Los Angeles, Long Beach area and the San Pedro area, Yangshan Deepwater Port, Rotterdam there in the middle photograph, the Dampier area, Fremantle or Headland, all ports, all sizes, all shapes, all have gateway issues. And I think that the theme for this conference about gateway ports and gateway thinking is absolutely spot on in terms of some of the most contemporary issues, I believe, facing ports. So in terms of the national context, we are a nation girt by sea. Ports are pretty important to us and our future, our current existence and also our future existence. I think three critical dimensions: the economic dimension and the access that ports provide us to world markets, absolutely fundamental. In 2011, our two-way trade reached over $600 billion, and we've heard about that significant growth over the last number of years. Exports, incredible. Imports, also significant. So the overall contribution that ports make to the economic productivity of our nation is unbelievably important. In terms of the social dimensions, certainly ports allow us to develop as societies. There is a societal development and diversification role that ports play. They are critical for our growth as a people and as a nation, both in urban, regional and remote communities, not just the big cities, but the urban and regional and remote communities are all influenced by port development. Certainly employment, there's figures out that says 1 in every 5 Australian jobs is in some way related to trade. So they do play a significant part in our social dimension. And in the environmental dimension, there is no doubt that moving goods by ports is the most efficient way to move ports around the globe. We heard from Mike earlier about the innovation and the initiatives underway by WWL to even improve that more so in coming years, and I think that's to be applauded. We can see there some of the key portals, some of the key gateways around the nation. They are various and they are varied, but they are equally important right the way around our coastline. At the end of the day, the challenge for planning and the challenge for strategic planning at ports, I believe, is about increasing confidence and thereby increasing economic productivity. Some of the issues facing the industry at the moment, or historically having faced the industry, I believe some of the problems were lack of alignment, some political tension between local, state and Commonwealth governments. I believe there's been a lack of clarity about port developments, about the size, the rate and the extent of them. I don't believe there has been, up until this point, any clear architecture for port and major industrial networks. And I think some of the underlying economic conditions obviously also play a part. The collection of those issues, I believe, leads to a lack of investment confidence, and that's what we need to change with our thinking and our approach. So future gateway thinking is about increasing confidence. To me, there's some critical parts here which I'll expand on in a short time. But it's about strategic alignment. It's about making sure that policy is aligned, and it's about making sure that we have the right regulatory settings to allow that policy to work. It's about better long-term planning, so helping increasing project certainty and possibly contemplating strategic approvals through the long-term planning. It's also about greater industry partnerships and greater collaboration, and again we've heard those themes throughout the presentations at today's conference. And it's obviously about network thinking. It's not just about the port, it's about the port, the community, the region, the space, those other broader transport connections, and I think we're starting to see some greater thinking in that area. So the collection of that future thinking is about increased confidence and increased economic productivity. So what are those top 3 key enablers that I can talk about briefly today? Strategic policy alignment is one of them. We must make sure that our policy settings are aligned. That is for land use planning, for freight, for transport networks and environmental. Policy must include port protection, and that must include the corridors to the port, the road, the rail and the sea. And we must include matching regulatory settings. There's some great examples in Seattle There's some emerging examples coming through in New South Wales in legislation, and some examples also coming through in Queensland now with some state planning reform. We must include areas beyond the port. It's not just about protecting the port land that we know it, it's about protecting those key corridors. Enhanced long-term master planning. I believe there's greater involvement needed from industry and other stakeholders, other customers in that master planning process. Ports can't plan in isolation. We must be talking, we must be collaborating with a whole range of stakeholders to make sure that we're developing the best port plans possible. We must include enhanced and verified data. We must base our plans on good data and on good science. And I think that's absolutely important moving forward. We must also we certainly have the need to focus on infrastructure needs and land uses at and around the ports, which I've touched on. Long-term master planning should include early consideration of environmental conditions and values, and there's a strategic environmental assessment process that enables that. And perhaps it's time to think about addressing some of those issues earlier in our planning to avoid issues during the project phases. I think with that there is the potential to offer Tier 1 strategic approvals for industry when they're looking to make investment decisions in our ports. I believe it would help if we had strategic approvals in place to enable more confident decisions to be made about projects. And industry partnerships, another key enabler. Governments, ports, investment partners, transport operators, resource and freight handlers. I believe there needs to be greater collaboration in the development of plans and greater collaboration in the way that ports are managed. We certainly need, together with that, strong governance support. That is from government, but also within organisations. So within port companies, we need that strong governance support. So in terms of policy alignment, how does it look at the moment? And this is not a reflection on Western Australia, this is a general comment throughout Australia in my experience. We have good pockets of work occurring in all different areas. Port master plans, council town plans, state port strategies, national port strategies. But the challenge is converting that into a more aligned thinking in terms of how we are developing our policy. So making sure that we have a clear, what I call line of sight planning between national strategies and what's happening on the ground. I believe that's where we need to move forward. So flowing from the national, through the state, through the regions, into the local context, I think we need better alignment. However, there is, and there's always a however, there's a quote from Churchill here, however beautiful the strategy, you should occasionally look at the results. And I think that's a key point. You can have a really nice shiny strategy that's sitting on the shelf that's not really effective. It's perhaps like having a new car without any fuel. So we do need to make sure that the alignment of policy is matched with the correct regulatory settings. Some of the work underway, which I believe is taking significant steps forward. The National Port Strategy, I believe, outlines a great architecture of a system that we can all work within. Similarly, the National Land Freight Strategy also achieves that goal. Ports Australia are leading some master planning guidance work to help assist ports understand the importance and understand them through that help them through that master planning process. The PANC group that we hear about sometimes, there's a technical working group working on master planning for ports, for existing ports and for future ports. So there's some great work happening around the industry. State planning systems are being reviewed, and certainly there's evidence of new emergence of partnerships. And where I'm from in Queensland, Abbott Point, there's certainly a great example of some partnerships occurring between 3 development companies at the Port of Abbott Point. We've seen that over the last 12 months. So in summing up, how is it a standard approach? Standard approach historically may have been about isolated thinking, silo thinking. It may have been about project by project management. It may have been about local economics, just an infrastructure focus and passive governance. I believe we need to move to new horizons, more collaboration, a partnership approach, strategic network management, a regional, state and national approach to our economic thinking, infrastructure and land use focus, and active collaborative governance. And I believe if we do move to those new horizons, we can increase productivity and investment confidence. And I believe also we can certainly increase the environmental management and environmental understanding of values around our significant port precincts. We've got a great network here. We've got a great industry. I'm very proud to be involved in the industry in various capacities. And I believe we've got a great future ahead of us. But the key, from my experience, that I'd leave with you today is about policy alignment, and it's about matching and activating regulatory settings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason and Joe, for an excellent strategic wrap-up on the day. Your chance for some final questions to both speakers. Anyone like to lead off? I certainly would like to. Joe? One thing we haven't really dug very deep on through the whole day, and maybe it's because I flew over here last night from the other coast, is the choice you will have to make between WA thinking and national thinking. Several speakers have commented that the failure of national coordination overseas and the abandonment of that was a costly lesson in those countries. But here we have a national ports reform going on to coordinate at a national level, and we are, as we said at the outset today, on the cusp in Western Australia of a whole new way of thinking. So to you, is this a choice? Does it fit easily together? Or should West Australian ports be remembering the lesson of those costly overseas failures of national coordination?
That's better. We certainly should take the lessons of the lack of coordination from the various countries around the world that have got it badly wrong. There's no question about that. But I think before we do that, what we need to do is reflect on the way that our economy and the way, and particularly in the north of the state, has developed. We've got legacy items that we need to manage, legacy items that stay with us because we've needed to use state agreements to build infrastructure in the early development of the state and the early development of the state's economy. That wasn't a bad thing, that was a very good thing, because we don't have in this country an indigenous source of capital that we could use. That means we had to recruit it from somewhere. And that capital wasn't going to flow into the state unless there was a security of tenure that had to go with it. And the best way to achieve that was with the use of state agreements. So that's the positive side of state agreements, but the negative side of state agreements and the legacy part that we now have to manage is that we have to reflect on making sure that any new ports that are built or any expansions in port capacity aren't constrained by those pieces of legislation that exist. So yes, national cooperation of course is necessary. Yes, we want to make sure that we're in lockstep with where the federal government's looking to go and the sorts of port strategies that we can reflect on around the country. We of course also want to be making sure that we are in primary thought in the federal government's mind when we're dealing with infrastructure spending around the place, but we also need to learn our own lessons from the past to make sure that we don't repeat them.
Any questions? Jason, you were concentrating on strategic alignment. If you are blunt about where we have failed so far on that, where there has not been investor certainty and where there in fact has been considerable doubt over the future of some particular projects, Where do you sheet home that responsibility? Is it collective, or are there areas still here in Western Australia where that breaks down, where we don't get the early, clear information for the proper strategic alignment?
Look, perhaps it comes simply through a lack of dialogue between different levels. Perhaps that's been a legacy issue of past. I'm sensing a real change in that though. So I believe that is absolutely fundamental to allowing ports to have, rather than a licence to operate, I think we should start saying a licence to grow. And I think if we see greater dialogue between different levels of government and greater partnerships between the port tenants and the port operators and port managers, I believe that that will change significantly.
Joe, would you agree then that this would be an area where this thinking of ports as gateways is a fresh change, where the port, as Steve suggested very earlier today, could well be the facilitator of more consultation that heads off some of those journeys up the cul-de-sac where we've seen an enormous amount of money committed, but ultimately then all of a sudden a big shift in the final strategy.
Look, I think it was Steve that said earlier in the day, and part of the presentation that he made, is that ports need to be more than ports, and I completely agree with that notion. They have to draw in and engage the local community, disseminate information about what they're trying to achieve in that area, how it is that they're going to go about it, and what the benefits, the net benefits are going to be that are going to flow into the community. You know, the days of ports working in isolation ought to be forgotten. And ports working in isolation from communities, and ports working in isolation from governments, and ports working in isolation particularly from government departments like ours are long gone, and should be long gone. They've got a coordinating role around all that. They've got a serious policy role that they need to pull together. Certainly, we, when I say we, I mean the government and government departments, can have an influence and certainly offer our advice and do all of the things that are necessary to help them achieve their objectives. But the thing that the final decision they've always got to remember is theirs, and we've also got to remember that. So all of those engagement issues they need to bring together, and they need to include all of the stakeholders. I hesitate to use that word, but you know, I can't think of a better one. But they need to bring all of that together if this is going to be managed in an appropriate way.
Beyond this conference, the change that is coming is the amalgamation. If that is to be coordinated in a coherent way, it will require the smart planet approach that was outlined earlier. It will require some fresh gateway thinking. Are we ready, do you believe, for that change? It will be implemented gradually, but are the individuals ready to coordinate, cooperate and move to a better way of doing business?
Well, I think they are, but this is not something that started now. This has been developed over a number of years now, and all of the various people that have needed to have an impact and an influence on that have had an influence on that. I think the ports have run this very cleverly and pulled it together to a point where the implementation of that can now be managed in a sensible way. One of the complicating factors of the consolidation of the ports will be in the Pilbara, and it will be because of the issue that I mentioned a moment ago, which is state agreements. The Pilbara ports and the people that have been working on this have been really open to detail and information and advice that's been flowing from the government departments that have been involved in this, and principally because we've charged with managing the state agreements from our department. And so this is not something that we need to start now. It started some time ago, And I think what we can take advantage of now is that good previous planning.
And Jason, finally then, when these regional authorities amalgamate, there is a risk that when you centralise control and authority, that some elements then feel they aren't clearly in the plan. When you go back to your 8 global ports that you assess, were there learnings there that would head off what might be ahead for Western Australia? Is it possible to have all of those cost efficiencies, to avoid the duplication, to drive towards ports adding value, all of the goals we've heard set out today, but how do we avoid the mistakes that you have seen in other parts of the world by centralising?
Look, one example probably jumps out. It's Vancouver. Port Metro Vancouver was the amalgam of 4 previous port authorities in that area of British Columbia. To me, it's about communication with those local communities, and it's about communication and bringing them on that journey of change. And it's about constant communication. And I think that was one of their learnings when they amalgamated with the areas that were previously recognised as their own port authority, not having that power. It was about communicating with those people and those communities, and that was their way through that issue. I think that's going to be faced here in the West. But I'm a very strong advocate for constant communication, both internally and externally from the organisation, to help people understand the vision of the port, understand the vision of the future, and also critically understand what the port's not going to be. I think that's a really important point as well. I think we can all focus on what the port is going to be, but there's sometimes a lot of benefit in actually explaining what the port's not going to be and the advantages that come from amalgamation.
If there are no further questions, would you please thank Joe Ostojich and Jason Sprott? And I'd ask Steve Lewis. Thank you, Joe. Steve Lewis, CEO of the Dampier Port Authority, our host, to give us some closing remarks.
Yes, thanks very much, Jeff. Yes, well, what a day. Yes, it's been a great day, and I think just to get to the end of it now, I think it's probably just time, I think, for everybody to be able to go and reflect on just what's come out of today. I think for me, just even Marie Taylor's welcome to country this morning was just an immediate highlight straight away for the conference, and it just got better and better, I think, after that. It's great to have the forum that WA Ports has created with this every 2 years getting together as a industry, and actually just having that space that we don't always get to actually think strategically and actually think about the industry we're in and where it should go. And I think today, from the various speakers we've had, have really highlighted a range of things for us to think about. Obviously, I'm very pleased also that the WA Ports over a year or so ago agreed that we could have ports as gateways as a theme. It already appears in the charter of Ports WA that ports are gateways, and I think it was good to have it as a conference theme. It has a very wide connotation, and obviously from Dampier's case we also feel that it's something that we're well down the track of understanding. So I hope that people from today came away with a better view of where ports are at now in WA, some international context we've had, plus some national context, and very, very useful. I'd like to congratulate all the speakers. I think they coped very well with various technology, etc., and trying to keep to time, and that's always an interesting thing with a conference, particularly when we all think we have something worthwhile saying, like now. I would also like to acknowledge the sponsors, obviously the key sponsors of Cube, Landcorp and Argonaut there. I think it's very important, as the comment was made before, without sponsors to these events, certainly government organisations like Ports couldn't run them. We couldn't justify the expense. But certainly having sponsors that are interested in the industry and prepared to put their own money in is a very good thing, and I'm very, very pleased that they've done that. I'd also like to mention some of the other sponsors which people have on the program, but certainly Yarra's sponsoring tonight's gala dinner for those that are going. in addition to your own registration. Pilbara, the Development Commission, Ken was here before, but just very good to see the Pilbara supporting that. Department of Transport was also a sponsor. Iron Ore Holdings, which was great to see those players. FMG, Northwest Shipping, also was very pleased to see. Australian Maritime Services, Atlas, OMC, all that list there that I'm looking at, and certainly Clayton Oates, we shouldn't forget, they sponsored lunch today, and I know while Paul didn't want to get up and say anything at the time and probably didn't actually get the opportunity, I'd really like to say they've been our lawyers for the last 11 years and they've been excellent. They know the port industry so well. But yes, so tonight, for those that are coming to the gala dinner, I would also make mention that it's 6:30 at Fraser's, at the top here, at the State Reception Centre, actually, above Fraser's, I should say. And it should be a great evening, a great opportunity for people to reflect on the day and also to swap notes. It's obviously formal attire. That's not black tie. For anybody that thought we were going black tie, we're not doing that. It's just come along with your suit, and if your partner's coming, hopefully they're nice and well dressed. It should be a good night. There's some good entertainment, and I think it'll be a good finish to today's proceedings. Without any further ado, but I'd just like to remind you too that ports are gateways, and they need to think like gateways. I think the next between conferences, that to me is going to be the mantra of of our whole association, and it has to be. I think on however you interpret gateways, it's where we need to get to. And don't forget, what would a smart port do, or what would a smart you do? Because it's amazing how that question sometimes can actually help yield some ideas. What we all know seem to have an idea of what a smart person would do, and why aren't we doing it? And finally, I'd like to thank the MC. I think Jeff McMullen's been outstanding. It's been really good having him here. I hope people get the chance tonight that come to the gala dinner to also talk to him. He's a very, very well regarded person. And it's been great having you, Jeff. You've really helped run it along and had some very good questions to help with the speakers. That's it for me. I thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing those that are at the gala dinner tonight. It'll be a great opportunity, and thanks for your participation.
Just a couple more thank yous, because we should also mention Northwest Shelf Shipping Company, Mermaid Marine, Australian Marine Services, Fortescue Metals Group, Benchmark Projects, OMC International and Atlas Iron, who all contributed or sponsored people who shared their ideas with us today. If you are coming to the gala dinner, it's at 6:30 p.m. at the WA State Reception Centre. And remember that feedback survey that you can do online. There's a little prize there. You can win a new iPad. Share it with one of your kids if you have one already. And I wanted to leave you with yet another thought from another wonderful book I've been reading on all of this wandering around the world that I do, because this man is probably the brightest human being I've met in over half a century of wandering the world. And he tackles in this book called The Social Conquest of the Earth. He's an earth scientist, Edward O. Wilson. And Tom Wolfe says this man is the new Charles Darwin. But he's not a catastrophe theorist or a pessimist. He tackles the questions that we have looked at today, and he says this: Earth, by the 22nd century, can be turned, if we so wish, into a permanent paradise for human beings, or at least the strong beginnings of one. We will do a lot more damage, he says with his usual chuckle, to ourselves and the rest of the world. But out of an ethic of simple decency to one another, the unrelenting application of reason and acceptance of what we truly are, our dreams will finally come home to stay. That, from the smartest man I've met in my travels. Very good advice, and I look forward to joining you at the dinner this evening. Have a very good night.